15 million men labored in the giant town. By the light of beacons that shed forth their glare both day and night. No light of heaven pierced through the smoke of the factories with which the town was circled. But sometimes the red disk of a rayless sun might be seen riding in the black firmament, where iron bridges plowed their way, and from which there descended a continual shower of soot and cinders.
Penguin Island, written by Anatole France in 1906, was a satire, and many found it amusing. In these last 2 decades of the 20th century, the sting of the satire remains, but no one is laughing. Once the Civil War was over, America rolled up its sleeves to catch up with the European Industrial Revolution. The goal was product, and more gross national product. It was a grand bacchanal of seemingly unlimited resources. It didn't matter how much energy was wasted, how many skies were blackened. Throughout the industrial world, the very symbol of progress was the billowing smokestack. From this orgy of progress and pollution, we have inherited the hangover.
With the acid rain question, there's no need for qualifiers. We are in deep trouble. We have every reason to be scared. You don't have to be a scientist to see what the problem is.
And we do know some things right now. We do know that acid rain does affect fisheries. We do know it does affect forest land and cropland. We know the facts are there.
In addition, many cases of cancer eventually develop from this continuous irritation from acid rain.
But if we don't do something about it soon, we will lose large part of the agricultural lands and other things on which we depend.
We know that acid rain is a real problem. It's poisoning our lakes, killing the aquatic life in those lakes, and we even fear that it's going to poison people because of the damage it does to the metals that can get into drinking water.
The problem is insidious. It's a problem that can go along for years and years, even decades, almost unnoticed. And then almost overnight...
Our yard has died, and we had our yard reseeded, topsoil and everything, and it came in beautiful, and then it just died.
Because I can't sleep on my second story, because when the fumes come in, I pass out.
With asthma or with some inborn pulmonary lung problem, this individual, any kind of insult, an infection, a viral or bacterial infection, or a toxin such as acid rain, when inhaled or when involving the lungs, may ultimately be fatal.
Acid rain. What is the worry? What is it? Microbiologist Dr. Jill Adler.
Acid rain is the production of sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxide by industrial and by car pollution that's released into the environment. And when it rains or when it snows or some type of precipitation, the sulfur oxides and the nitrogen oxides react with the water and form sulfuric acid and nitric acid. It's a difficult thing to measure because it's not something that you can see. You have to use instrumentation. You can't look at the rain and say, well, this rain has a pH of 2.3. pH is an expression of the acidity or the alkalinity of a solution, and we express that in terms of a pH scale, which goes from 0 to 14. 0 is the most acid solution, and 14 is most basic solution. And if you wanted to measure the acidity or the alkalinity of something, you would put it in a pH meter.
When nitric and sulfuric oxides rise, they mix with the moisture of the atmosphere to become acid rain, acid snow, acid smog. The world's two chief polluters, industry and the automobile. Every year, this internationally known auto race from London to Brighton commemorates England's pioneering achievements, along with France and Germany, in developing the automobile. When these cars were on the road at the turn of the century, there were only a few thousand cars in all of the world. Today, there are over 400 million. Lord Montagu is one of the sponsors of this classic event. He is a member of Parliament and an active conservationist.
We have had very careful planning here to make quite sure that the people don't destroy the very beauty of the thing they're coming to see. What we're trying to do is not just show a collection of cars, but to tell the history of motoring from the very early days right up to modern times. And not only the history of the car from a technical point of view, but also the social history of how the motor car had its impact on civilization. But it does commemorate the freedom of the motorist, and now people, of course, are questioning whether the motorist should have as much freedom, and will the oil crisis, in fact, bring a completely different situation as far as the motorist is concerned. Of course, the motor car must be blamed for a lot of pollution.
What a dramatic moment. It's all right, it's going, hooray!
Some of these cars run on steam or batteries, but most of them use the traditional oil-based product, gasoline. And it's the automobile and the emission of its byproducts that have spawned the greatest proportion of acid rain. After World War II, the romance of the road was becoming stifled in exhaust fumes. The internal combustion engine helped create a new phenomenon and a new word: smog. So, the automobile as polluter not only gives us acid precipitation, but sends other chemicals sweeping from the roadway skyward, sending the effluents into surrounding forests, clinging to tree branches and trunks. California Forest Ranger Jim Bridges talks about the forerunner of acid rain, one of man's earlier sky-carried pollutants, smog, and the problem of ozone damage.
We have approximately 100,000 acres that are in the severe or moderate smog-polluted area, where we are experiencing quite a few trees of this condition. This is a typical classical smog-impacted tree. This lack of needles reduces the amount of food that the tree produces. It gets in a weaker condition and is much more susceptible to any other type of disease or insect attack. This situation is similar in a way to the acid rain situation that you have back east, although what we have here is a different chemical composition, the ozone and of the air pollution.
In the 1960s, studies on air pollution in Southern California proved that smog was seriously damaging the citrus crops. It was also attacking the vineyards. This is especially critical in California, the #1 agricultural state in the Union, and one of the world's foremost food-producing areas. Dr. Robert Musselman, University of California, Riverside, brings us an update.
My research has shown that smog is very detrimental to plants. Research at Corvallis, Oregon, Environmental Protection Agency, has shown that smog drastically reduces crop yields in many crops, such as tomatoes, beans, cotton, corn, soybeans, grapes.
The 1970s, smog attacks continue, but something even more ominous emerges: acid rain from the automobile's nitrous oxides. Acid rain from factory emissions of deadly SO2, sulfur dioxides.
Indicated that of the 250 commercial crops in California, about half of them may be sensitive to SO2, sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide gets deposited on leaves of plants as well as gases that are absorbed by plants. The plants may show leaf burns, growth is reduced, and yields of crops are reduced somewhat. The most susceptible crops appear to be beans, lemon, oranges, and grapes. Nearly half of California's crop could suffer damages from SO2, sulfur dioxide. In California, the impacts of wet deposition, that is acidic precipitation, is of great concern, mainly because of the prevailing trend to switch from oil firing plants to coal firing plants, coal which contains sulfur in varying degrees. There is a distinct possibility of long-distance transport of atmospheric pollutants, including sulfur dioxide. The prevailing winds are from west to the east through the Sacramento Valley and then south to the San Joaquin Valley, and eventually over the western rim of the Sierra Nevada.
These effluents fall into soil not rich enough to withstand this chemical attack. True, some soil can handle acids and even utilize them, but this is not the case in California's High Sierra. Philip Burton, Federal Interior Committee, has said, scientists from Lawrence Berkeley Lab have shown that high concentrations of metals could occur in Lake Tenaya in Yosemite and in 2 other lakes in the Sierra. When lakes are surrounded by thin soil, they cannot buffer acid fallout, and those lakes become open targets. The problems that are just emerging in the western states may become, in a very few years, as critical and deadly as they already are in northeastern America.
It's 1/5 of the state of New York, the Adirondack Park. It's roughly north of Albany and north of Syracuse. It's a 6 million acre state park, which is a conglomeration of private and public lands. We are the most region in the United States by acid rain and snow. There are almost 300 lakes which are, to all intents and purposes, sterile or barren. That means that practically all of the aquatic life has been wiped out, such as fish and amphibians and a great many of the aquatic insects. It's my feeling that soon we're going to see effects on the forest, such as die-offs, either due to tree diseases or insects, but basically caused by the stress on trees from acid deposition and the effects on their roots.
Meteorologist Dr. Robert Stinson of California State University, Dominguez Hills, puts it this way.
Well, basically, we're all dependent upon water. And this is attacking the water supply. It's attacking our rainfall. It's attacking everything.
If it keeps on increasing this pollution in intensity and volume, what might happen to human life?
Might wipe it out.
For example, the sulfates.
Jane Hagedorn is an executive officer for the American Lung Association.
Sulfate concentrations greater than 9 or 10 micrograms per cubic meter of air will aggravate asthma and lung function in children. This is no, end quote, this is no small measure. When you look at the close to, at last count, we were looking at 20 million people in the United States who suffer from asthma alone. And that's just one of the chronic lung diseases we're concerned about.
We know what it does to delicate skin, and even more so to the delicate lung tissue, causing chronic infection, chronic bronchitis, and chronic emphysema.
If you speak in a non-scientific manner and just stop to ask yourself what an acid is and remember how corrosive it can be. You've seen acid destroy metal, for example, or eat the paint off a car. You've certainly seen what it can do, I'm sure, at one time or another to a piece of meat. Now just imagine what the vapor of an acid, which is inhaled, what effect it can have on the most delicate of tissues, that is the lung. It's going to destroy it.
Not only have smog, acid rain, and acid snow been assaulting our lungs, but in spring of 1982, a story about a new member of the sky acid family appeared. An atmospheric phenomenon known as acid fog. Acid fog was brought to light by a team of researchers at California Institute of Technology, headed by Dr. Michael Hoffman, who presented the problem in historical perspective.
In London in 1952, where there were about 6,000 to 7,000 excess deaths recorded during a 5-day extended period of fog. The concentration of pollutants emitted to the atmosphere at that time was quite high: sulfur dioxide, nitric oxide, and particulate. These were trapped in a stagnant fog system, resulting in a number of fatalities, especially in elderly people who already had upper respiratory diseases such as emphysema and bronchitis. But those death rates, 1,000 per day, are quite significant.
Not all emissions are potentially dangerous acids. These ominous-looking outpourings from a major oil company are basically non-polluting steam. It is often the seldom-seen effluents that are the dangerous ones, the toxic ones. From the end of World War II to the early 1970s, it was felt that a key solution to complaints by neighbors of factories and refineries was simply to build the stacks higher. This would suck in more air and burn the fuel more efficiently. The tall stacks also carried the choking smoke up into the clouds, the slipstream, and far away from the industrial town. But there were unforeseen results. As the oxides of nitrogen and sulfur were transported long distances, they combined with the moisture in the air and formed acids. So neither industry nor townsfolk had solved the problem. They had merely made it more deadly and transported it somewhere else. Dr. Bart Sokolov, environmental engineer, UCLA.
We know an awful lot about the technical fixes for acid rain. The question is whether politically people will be motivated enough to be able to actually take the action, to spend the money, and be motivated enough to do something about the problem.
Tuesday night when we closed at midnight, it was about 12:20 when we pulled out of the store. You couldn't hardly breathe out here in this parking lot.
And we got up the next morning and there was this film all over the truck, and you wiped your hands on it, and it turned out to be an oily grease. And it left little specks that did not...
Direct line with the refinery, and the oil just completely covered her, and her fur was all caked together instead of being fluffy.
Dog is going to have to sleep because I can't afford to pay for the medication that he needs every day. I wrote a letter to the mayor of Carson, telling about the pollution. They said they'd get back to me, and they never got back to me.
The crescendoing chorus of local complaints resulted in a town hall meeting, typical of grassroots protests. Perhaps a chemical plant is targeted for toxic waste, or a power company for fly ash. But this particular hearing is to determine whether a local refinery polluting the area with airborne acids and particulate matter should or should not be granted a variance to continue operation.
We believe that once the evidence is fully presented and then dispassionately assessed by the hearing board, that we will be given and should be given the opportunity to operate the plant and perfect the equipment.
I know that efficient, non-polluting refinery technology has been available for many years, which does not require experimenting with people as guinea pigs. Thank you.
I don't care about money. I could care less about whether you lose dollars. Don't I have a right as a human being to be able to breathe air?
I do have a statement and a few remarks I'd like to make. This board has no control over anything but this specific case. Well, Your Honor, yes, sir. Mr. Dennis, I must be a man from Mars or somebody different. I mean, nobody else has been asked that question but me. But to answer your question, yes, sir, I do. They say that every time Fletcher oil cranks up, all this pollutant and stuff is in the air. It only comes out when the machinery is malfunctioning And it seems to me like the machinery is all times malfunctioning. Perhaps we need to close it down because it's malfunctioning all the time. Thank you. Oh, you want me to sit down now? Yes. Well, I think I better quit while I'm here, sir. Thank you.
Executive Officer in California's Air Quality Management District, Jim Barakos.
Orders shift, they change, we send inspectors out. We set up a program in Carson where inspectors from the Carson office, we have an office in Carson, are available on 24 hours a day at a moment's notice to respond to a complainant.
And what did the city or region do about the complaints? What did they do?
Absolutely nothing.
Some of them have seemed to be on our side, but the majority of them are for the industry. It's kind of obvious.
For safety and survival, for health and quality of life, what can be done? When city and regional action fails, what can be done at the state level?
Industries and others have advocated that we wait while more research is done to find out just exactly whose acid is raining on whose parade. And we're going to find more and more that interstate transport of pollution is recognized as a severe environmental problem, and that agencies are going to have to work out mechanisms for dealing with these problems and maybe in some cases securing equity for the receptors of pollution.
Equity against polluters? How? What action has been taken at the federal level?
The Congress is reauthorizing the Clean Air Act this year. I think an essential part of the Clean Air Act should be some recognition of the acid rain problem and developing a legislative strategy to deal with it. The administration is saying, let's just study it.
We should be doing everything we can right now to reduce the negative impacts of acid rain. 20 years from now, when all the facts are in, it's going to be a little too late. It's going to be very expensive, and we're going to do extensive damage to not only people's property, but their health as well.
The Environmental Protection Agency has announced that it's willing to increase research funds available for acid rain study to $20 million a year, yet never, at the same time they've announced amendments to the Clean Air Act, which, if adopted, would result in the creation of more acidity in the atmosphere. This particularly with respect to the oxides of nitrogen standards, which the administration proposes to double.
It's argued that government is over-regulating. The burden of government is much too great for the nation to bear, and therefore it's necessary, in the words of Detroit, to cut down on safety regulations in cars, to cut down on the devices required to control the emissions of pollutants into the atmosphere. Those who want standards relaxed have effectively organized in their economic self-interest. They do a very good job of lobbying because they have money to hire skilled public relations practitioners. The ordinary people, the rank and file members of the electorate who want clean air, are not that well organized in their self-interest.
The way one fights back in the environmental movement is to get active politically. I think the biggest problem in the environmental movement today is it is too fractionated, it is not political enough. One has to target legislators and get rid of them. One has to take determined political action, supporting and fighting against candidates, and you have to do it not just in election years, but every year, all the time.
What argument do they have against James Watt, America's steward of land, water, and air?
The reason that the appointment and subsequent actions of James Watt has so outraged not only the environmental community, but all of the citizens of the country is his outspoken goal to remove from the public domain all of the natural resources of the United States into private hands.
I'm David Hansen. We represent a number of small American citizens who have put their life savings, their hard work into a piece of land in the Santa Monica Mountains. We feel that the Sierra Club is threatening to confiscate that land for public park full compensation.
I work for the federal government, and I'm here to see if I can help you. To me, this is the type of demonstration I like.
James Watt Secretary of the Interior commented, "Acid rain is an emotional, political issue. I have people telling me all the time there's no one qualified to write about it. Next year, we're going to have a new scare."
Mr. Secretary,
yes.
Are you also making light of the 1 million names on signatures that were turned in by the Sierra Club and what appears to be a growing number of people that are opposed to the job?
How many are going to have questions on this petition issue? We'll get them all over at once.
Yeah.
Is that the question everybody's going to ask? One question, we'll get rid of it forever, okay? The question about the petition drive, million signatures, a lot of names that are seeking to have me removed from office, and we consider that petition drive to be a very, very successful membership drive for the clubs. I think I've disposed of that issue neatly and cleanly for all day.
Mr. Secretary, do you feel...
One of the sad things about the present administration is, although it claims to be conservative, it has radicals in the most important positions as far as the environment is concerned. Now, Mr. Watt is always raving on television about how he wants to do things for people, but almost all the things that he's doing are things that destroy our environment and therefore, in the long run, will destroy people.
Mr. Secretary,
Would you rule out any drilling in a wilderness area?
I would be violating my oath of office to categorically rule out all drilling on all wilderness areas. And I've taken an oath of office, and as you sense by my speeches, I'm a law and order man, so I would not violate the law in that way.
Well, James Watt is a curious and complex personality. He belongs to that tiny minority of people on this earth who are expecting the end of this world, Armageddon, and a second coming. He said that we need not worry about our earth because it won't be with us that much longer. That's his imposition of a religious point of view in his duties as a public servant. Sometimes desires or hopes get in the way or conflict, and our need for oil may conflict with our need for clean air or clean water. In those cases, his oath of office, the law, and the protection of all of our people are in his hands. And our hope has to be that the laws and orders that he's going to follow are really in our best interests.
Whether in the wilderness or in the cities, the problem is urgent. Who is taking action? Between industry and government, who has done more to control pollution?
That's easy. Industry has been spending money in great quantities for over 30 years in the control of pollution, whereas the government nationwide has just gotten into it since the early 60s, and as a result, the funds are nowhere near what has been spent by industry.
In order to attempt to reach
Glenn J. Bjorklund, Vice President, Southern California Edison.
Basin, we've reduced the sulfur content of our oil from 0.5% to 0.25%, and I might add that's at a premium of about $250 million a year. Additional cost for us to purchase this ultra-low sulfur oil.
From a person who has emphysema during a Los Angeles smog siege quite often has to go to his or her physician, and naturally that incurs a cost to the individual. When we talk about a cost of pollution control to industry, such as the oil industry, you're talking about just that. It is a cost. It is not a profit-making venture by any means. The cost of building and operating these pollution control plants is hundreds of millions of dollars. There are many ways of equating the cost of pollution.
Sudbury, Ontario, Canada, ground zero. If some years ago the people of Sudbury had weighed the long-range cost of immediate profit against the future of their environment, What was once a beautiful forest might not today be a moonscape.
The nickel smelting plant at Sudbury, till a few years ago, the emissions were in the order of 7,000 tons a day. Comparative size, I suppose we're talking about an area in Canada that is sensitive to acid rain, that is about 2/3 the area of the United States. But the area that we're really concerned about is the area here from north of Toronto, across Ontario into southern Quebec, and then across the United States, the northeast United States, into Nova Scotia. Well, in Canada, I think our calculation is that roughly 50% we produce ourselves, but 50% comes from the United States. In some local areas, such as just north of Toronto in the Muskoka Lake Country, the Haliburton Highlands, I think it's up to 75% of the pollution we believe comes from the States. Now, in the United States, on the other hand, we contribute to 10% of the pollution in the northeast United States. Well, what should be done about it?
Toronto, Ontario, Canada, an action seminar on acid precipitation. This is only one of scores of regional and international meetings on the problem of transboundary pollution, particularly between the United States and Canada. Many leading scientists, doctors, sociologists, and environmentalists are here to exchange information and ask important questions. Why, for instance, with billions of dollars being poured into pollution control, are many areas getting worse? Why has the level of acid precipitation become critical? From the International Hydrographic Institute of Sweden, Dr. Svante Odin.
Because of its impact in all kinds of systems, very equivalent to a chemical warfare that goes on between the different countries. Because there's a tremendous cost for those countries which are being polluted from acid rain. We have estimates that the Canadian emission of sulfur moves straight across the Atlantic, and roughly 10 or maybe 15% is brought down over Europe, but Northern Europe specifically.
Dr. Henning Ruda, International Hydrographic Institute, University of Stockholm, Sweden.
Well, after we published our report in 1971 about the acid precipitation and its causes and its effect, a very ambitious study was undertaken under the auspices of Norwegian Air Research Laboratory in Oslo. They measured sulfur in air in precipitation for several years, for 3-4 years. And then finally, 2 years ago, they came out with their final report. It confirms that the sulfur actually is transported long distances, that much of our sulfur here in Scandinavia comes from other countries.
Because England had solved some of its effluent problems by building its stacks higher, it had also created transboundary pollution. The Scandinavian countries are suing England, among others, in the International Court of The Hague. What was the English reaction to this lawsuit, the first of its kind? In charge of the new forest at Bewley Castle, Graham Carter.
Well, it's an interesting problem, and one must sympathise with the Scandinavians if they feel that sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere is causing an increase in acidity and rainfall. And it will be interesting to see the results of this very interesting action. However, I think it's fair to say that Britain has probably made more progress than practically any other nation in terms of improvement of pollution control, particularly in the post-war years.
Acid rain is a phenomenon that affects the Nordic countries, even as it affects Canada and the United States. And we learned that the atmosphere of the world is a very sophisticated chemical series of actions and interactions, and that pollution can in fact travel global distances.
In essence, acid precipitation is the tip of the iceberg, in that it has made itself known to our society, but it's the unknown that worries us and concerns us, because we are looking at what is the total picture of atmospheric deposition.
What can be done to make this total picture of atmospheric deposition known throughout the world? Geneva, Switzerland, United Nations. A special 34-nation high-level session on acid precipitation in November 1979. The meeting is chaired by the delegate from Norway, a prime sufferer from airborne acids. It is officially opened by one of the Northern Hemisphere's leading polluters, the United States. Douglas Kossel, head of the EPA under the Carter administration.
Mr. Chairman, this is, as you stated, an historic occasion. We are taking a major step.
Representing Yugoslavia, World Authority on Air Pollution and Executive Director of the United Nations Special Session, Janos Stanovnik.
The acid rain and the transboundary long-distance air pollution is a very serious problem. And it is getting more serious as our civilization is increasingly using fossil fuels. And more particularly, if we are in future to move more from what we rely now on oil more into coal, this matter will become even more serious. You must be aware that from the beginning of this century until today, we have probably increased up to some 10 times the use of fossil fuels.
The airborne sulfur pollutants cause health hazards.
We are listening to the translator for the Swedish Minister of Agriculture.
They cause enormous material losses. Millions of dollars worth of corrosion damage. Civilization's treasures are threatened by destruction. But the greatest danger of airborne sulfur pollutants is the damage they cause to the environment. Lakes become acidified. The groundwater is also affected. Fish life is becoming extinct in heavily acidified lakes. Scientists give warning of a decrease in forest and agriculture. But this is not all. The opportunity for industrialized societies to enjoy a clean and unspoiled countryside is an invaluable asset in the life of people living in heavily polluted towns. It is important to their quality of life. People will be deeply concerned if the countryside around them is spoiled and poisoned.
Since nearly all our pollution relates to how we use or misuse energy, how much does the world need? And does one nation, the United States, really need over 1/3 of the energy-producing sources? To start cleaning up the air we breathe, we can cut back on overconsumption and search out and develop new, non-polluting energy alternatives. The first indication of independence, moving away from the coal and oil energy base, is plurality, choices. Most familiar, because it is the most controversial, is nuclear. But there are many other sources.
This system, this project, started in 1960 with units 1 and 2. We now have 15 units at the project with a total capacity of 906,000 kilowatt hours. Thermal is hard-pressed to become a full alternative energy source in today's world picture. Most countries in the world are now producing geothermal, or at least exploring geothermal. Within the PG&E system, this represents somewhere in the neighborhood of over 7% of what we generate. Mexico has geothermal, Japan has geothermal. This project happens to be the largest in the world and is presently being expanded.
This is not just a prototypal plant. This is really paying for itself?
Oh, yes, definitely. It is paying for itself. These particular plants operate year-round, 24 hours a day. Geothermal has many benefits. One of the large ones is that it's a natural process. Natural meaning that the steam comes out of the ground and to the power plant, in contrast to oil that has to be processed to be burned as a fuel. So we take it right out of the ground and to the power plant. It does not have to be processed. I think the leading, again, if we use geothermal, it'll definitely be the leading one. Next to that, I think the one that has the largest potential is going to be wind generation. That is being explored, that is being used.
We're real excited about wind energy in the United States. Wind is a clean resource. It doesn't create water pollution. It doesn't require extensive amounts of water for cooling. It doesn't create hazardous wastes. And what's better yet, The wind is free. It doesn't cost anything. We think wind energy is going to be a boom industry of the 80s and 90s, and we expect billions of dollars of investment in wind energy over the next 20 years, and we expect that over 10% of our electrical needs in the United States could be satisfied by wind energy within 20 years. For the next several years, all these hills are going to be dotted with hundreds of wind turbines as we continue to develop our wind farm in this area.
Hydroelectric power, a clean and relatively abundant source of energy. And in extracting work power from water, there is the primal force of the ocean tides. Over 1,800 computerized mirror modules focus the sun's heat onto a collecting tower. This sends the heat into a vast system of pipes filled with extensively mineralized water. Steam from this conversion system goes directly into the generation of electricity. To extract value from what was once considered waste, biomass, another source of virtually non-polluting.
Some of the fuels we use, a variety of them, primarily is almond shell from the California Almond Growers Exchange.
These cogeneration plants will operate on basically any material that will burn. The amounts of fuel we go through are approximately 80,000 tons of fuel a year. Most of that is made up from the almond growers, 50 to 60, 70%, depending on the crop year. The remainder is supplemental fuels. Those are the wood chips and the peach pits and whatever we have to fill in with.
Very simply, cogeneration in this plant means that we use the energy twice. We take almond shell as our primary fuel, set it on fire in a boiler, and generate steam. That steam is used to run a turbine to make electricity.
This trestle that you're looking at behind us is essentially Imitech's lifeline to the almond growers. This shell, which is blown over in this tube, again goes into our reclaimer pile and is used as the main fuel for the power plant. The steam, which is excess or used the second time, is blown back over on this trestle and used as process steam for Foremost McKibben and for the almond growers in their food processing. That, in effect, is what makes this a cogeneration plant.
This plant alone will save about 200,000 barrels of oil a year, and coupled with other cogeneration plants around the country would reduce the import of oil considerably.
Even if we're able to substantially use all of the alternatives we now know of for electrical power production, we won't be able to significantly reduce our dependence or need for imported oil, coal, or nuclear power for the foreseeable future, at least till the year 2000.
But we as individuals don't have to wait till the year 2000. We already have workable alternatives. In Berkeley, California, this grassroots research house has achieved 30% energy self-sufficiency. Spokesperson and co-founder Helga Okalski.
I think that the Interglobal House has meaning in several ways in terms of energy conservation and energy generation, actually. Perhaps the most obvious is the food production. Food that you grow close to the home is often the most energy intensive to produce on the farm, while the food that can be grown best on the farm, grains for example, are the least energy intensive to produce there. But there are other ways, of course, that illustrate how the Integral Urban House is capturing and conserving energy. There's the solar collector to heat hot water, the pond that is aerated by a windmill. I don't think that living a more self-reliant lifestyle in the city means that you have to go back to a kind of a primitive America or an ugliness of some sort.
When technologies change, lifestyles follow. But to get the most out of new technologies, they must be utilized intelligently. The particular geography of an area will indicate the appropriate alternative energy source.
You're looking at a dairy that represents a change in lifestyles. This particular dairy, like so many California dairies, is basically there to produce milk. We've decided, however, that manure may be just as valuable as the milk. And the overall plan is to make more money for the dairy, but also to increase the self-sufficiency of this particular dairy land to the point where it can afford to stay here despite urban crowding. The noise you hear in the background is a generator. Actually, it's an engine that runs a generator. That generator is powered by methane gas, which is made by a manure digester, and the electricity is subsequently sold to the local utility. The cows, the manure, produces approximately 1.5 times as much electricity as this dairy needs. The manure that falls in the barn on concrete is scraped into a large tank, which is called a mixed tank. And that tank, in turn, is agitated and then pumped into the digester. The digester is a big hole in the ground, insulated, and covered with a plastic fabric. The manure that's pumped into this big hole is heated, and then after 21 days, out of the back end of the digester comes the effluent. You get about 1/3 efficiency out of a cow. If you add the manure potential to that, you get a 2/3 efficiency, 100% increase in efficiency. Now that 100% increase in efficiency is an enormous jump in potential. And if we were to look at our resources, we'd find that our situation didn't have the measure of desperation that we think it has. The biblical era, which we are in some ways just coming out of, the environment was seen as something to be conquered. I think that we have come to a point now where the environment has a biblical quality of its own. It tells us what our limits are.
I feel the real bottom line on this whole acid rain problem, which seems to be the second most critical environmental threat our country's faced with today, is ethics. If you put your garbage in my backyard, I'm going to be really mad. And if I throw my garbage in your front yard, you're going to be mad too. And that's essentially what people, state by state, nation by nation, are doing to each other, because air pollution knows no boundaries. And this, I think, is the ethical consideration we have to have for each other.
I think the extent of the problem of acid rain has only first begun to be appreciated, and I think the problem has been with us for a much longer time than we were aware of. And I'm particularly concerned today because we're taking a policy of energy independence in this country, and that means we're going to have to rely more on coal. And much of the coal in this country, in some areas of this country, is particularly rich in sulfur, and as a result, we're going to be producing more sulfur oxides, releasing them into the environment, which could make this problem of acid rain even worse than it's been.
At a time when the Reagan administration and the industries in this country that are affected by the Clean Air Act are trying to roll back that legislation and in some ways to gut the Clean Air Act completely, we need to get the public to let their representatives know that they don't want the Clean Air Act less restrictive, and they want the Clean Air Act to be more restrictive in dealing with the problems of acid rain.
When we get
Into questions of clean air, the Sierra Club, with its 190,000 members and very small budget, is matched against Detroit. We're matched against the big oil companies. So wherever we turn, wherever we try to do something worthwhile, we are overmatched financially. I guess the difference is that we work hard enough to keep our heads above water, as it were.
In order to stop acid rain, we've got to change the way our society functions, because every time you burn fossil fuel, you are potentially contributing to acid rains. It means that we have to limit our population and start reducing it. We have to have much more fuel-efficient vehicles. We have to use as little energy to get the things done we need to get done as we possibly can, because as long as we have fossil fuel power plants and automobiles and a growing population and not enough conservation, we're going to have acid rain until, of course, the acid rain shuts down the ecological systems of the planet, and that will mean the end of our civilization. Then we probably won't have any more acid rain.
Mankind has been polluting and destroying this planet for centuries. Have we already come too far? If we attempt to hold on to the old ways, to a mono-energy system based on fossil fuels, coal and oil, yes. But is this the only way? The technological transformations are at our fingertips. We can assimilate them, utilize them, and flourish, or misuse them and gamble on our extinction. Yet, how do we attack a problem that is often invisible, but covers our cities and wilderness alike? By discovery and research. By political involvement. By responsible human action. There is something all of us can do at every human level. Some years past, the American naturalist and philosopher Henry David Thoreau wrote, "Man's capacities have never been measured. What old folks say you cannot do, you try and find that you can. So little has been tried." It is our world, our choice. We needn't wait until we die for heaven. This planet could be our Eden.
The Council of Environmental Quality in the U.S. has estimated $2 billion a year as the structural cost.
The American Society of Microbiology, they will have a symposium discussing the effect of acid rain on the soil and how
There is technology now. It's a matter of how costly it is.
Medical testimony and medical evidence that these chemicals, in particular the dioxides, can cause lung damage. Well, in a young child...
Within a 1 mile radius, within 1 week, there were 8 crib deaths. And it all happened during a rainy period, which what we found out in the case...
And freedom. And the president has turned to me and he said, "Jim Watt, I want you to manage 1/3 of America to restore America's greatness."
That Watt is kind of confused. He claims to be a steward for God, and I don't see the connection. He seems to be going toward development.
It is shared by all at this meeting that the environment is one, that we are interdependent, and that we must join in responding to environmental threats, both for our own sakes and for those of future generations.